hello everyone. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and I am on vacation. And I thought I would share this video with you because this is what happened. This is what happens to people in my family that go on vacation with a history teacher. We end up going to all these history sites, and I'll show you who I'm with. This is my wife, Katrina.
We had the best day.
Well, it's been a bunch of days actually, and I thought I would share how it started, how it's all come together, and where we were today, and all the history. This is Standards Plus History Academy, so I thought I'd share with you all the history. The Natchez Trace, by the way, if you hear something in the background, it's raining. We're driving, and it's raining, so my windshield wipers are on. But the Natchez Trace runs 444 miles from Natchez, Mississippi, up to Nashville, Tennessee. And it runs almost right by our house. And we've wanted to do this for a while. It's just one of them things you put off and put off. None of the kids ever wanted to do anything like that. So the kids are gone, so we can do it. So we got on the Natchez Trace, the northern terminus, which is what they call it, which is literally right at the Loveless Cafe. If you know anything about Nashville and some of the sites, the Loveless Cafe is one of the must-see spots in Nashville. And the Natchez Trace starts there or finishes there, depending on which direction you're going. So we were going south, and we went half the distance down to Tupelo, Mississippi the first night. So it's about 220 some miles. Some of you may be asking, well, what is the Natchez Trace? It was, there's a lot of importance to Natchez Trace. During the height of the slave trade, they called it the slave highway, and slaves would be imported into the United States in the north, bought and sold at auctions, and transported down the Natchez Trace down into the heart of the Confederacy, ending up in Natchez, Mississippi, possibly. So that was one of the roles that the Natchez Trace played. It was also important in the Civil War, for obvious reasons, to both sides. It was important to trade before they could use steamboats to sail against the current in the Mississippi River. They'd sail downstream with their longboats or barges, whatever, drop off everything in the Natchez area, big port there, and then walk back up along the Natchez Trace to get home. And so there's all kinds of historical markers along the way, and so for whatever you're there to see, you'll see little communities. Like there's a French community there called Frenchtown. I think it was called Frenchtown, and it was started by a bunch of French traders, fur traders, and that was where you could stop and rest for the night or get a meal. There was an English town, so you obviously know what that is. There's all kinds of trails along the way, side trails, there's waterfalls, there's just a lot of things to see. Most of the things you can stop and see quickly and still be on your way, but then there's picnic spots everywhere. It's very scenic. The part we started on in the Tennessee area is very scenic, twisty, turny, up and down, lots of trees, very beautiful rivers, streams, waterfalls. Then you get down into the Alabama and then Mississippi, and it gets kind of flat, and but it's beautiful in another way. And so we spent our first night in Tupelo. Oh, the other thing about the Natchez Trace, if you like to take road trips, it is perfect. There's no traffic. There's literally no traffic. You're out there all by yourself. I got flashed by a cop once because I was exceeding the speed limit, but other than that, he didn't stop me. Other than that, there's just hardly any traffic. It's just a very leisurely trip. So we go down to Tupelo the first night, and of course Tupelo is the birthplace of Elvis Presley, and not a lot going on in Tupelo other than that, But we did spend the evening over at his birthplace and looking at his home where he grew up until he was about 11 or 12 or 13, somewhere there where they left Tupelo in the middle of the night. They even had a car there. The car that they traveled 100 miles to Memphis going north. The family was dirt poor. I mean, dirt poor. And it was in the bad section of town. Can't remember what they called it, the name of it, but it was.
Under the hill?
No, that was Natchez. Anyway, that's why he had such a good relationship with African American kids, because that's really where he grew up. And anyway, it was kind of an interesting story how he got his first guitar. He was upset. His mom was going to buy him. They took him down to the hardware store to buy him, I think it was a bike, but the bike was too expensive. And then she wanted to buy him a guitar. He didn't want a guitar, he wanted a gun. She wanted to buy him a gun, so they compromised and they got him a guitar. And he started playing on the guitar. Kind of interesting how that started. He sang with the, as he learned how to play the guitar, he started singing. And one of the plaques there said that one of the witnesses said, well, he was all right, but he playing that guitar, but as far as singing was concerned, he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, which is interesting to say about Elvis Presley of all people. But they were so poor, and there was, Elvis's twin died at birth, and so the mom basically took care of Elvis by herself because Daddy was in prison for a good bit. And according to the information that we read, mom and son lived on commodities, which I would think means like welfare. And when Daddy got out and they just couldn't make a living, they all decided to pack up the car. And the car, I was really surprised how small it was. It looked like a large car from the outside, but it was mostly, shell. And when you get to the inside, the seats were actually pretty small, and the interior of the car was actually pretty small. But anyway, they packed up everything they owned in that car, and they went 100 miles north to Memphis, started a new life, and the rest is history with Elvis. One of the things we noticed was, we've been to Graceland too, and if any of you have ever been to Graceland is what you would imagine somebody who grew up in a trailer park would think is a fancy house if you just suddenly, if they came into a bunch of money. I mean, I don't know how to describe it other than to say it's white trash meets money. And so we always laughed about that. And of course, it's in a terrible section of town in Memphis. They got a big fence around it now, but it's in a bad section of town. It's not really that big. You'd think of a big mansion, because they call it, a mansion, but it's really not that big. And it looks like it's been added on to and added on to and added on to. So it totally explains Elvis and Graceland. When you see where he was born and raised, and you understand the context of how he grew up, it explains Graceland. We thought, what's wrong with Elvis? Why would he have a house? He really liked gaudy things, gaudy clothes, gaudy rings, jewelry, gaudy car. There's in Nashville where we live, at the Country Music Hall of Fame, there's a replica of Elvis's limousine, and it was all gold, and he had a gold telephone in it. He just liked showy, gaudy stuff. But when you see where he grew up, it totally makes sense. And of course, right across the street from that little house they lived in, a little shotgun house, was a charismatic church, some sort of a Assembly of God, where of course he went over and he was very much influenced by that church and all the singing. So from Tupelo, the next day we got in the car and off we went to Natchez, still on the Natchez Trace. So that's the southernmost terminus. Of course, I was excited to see Natchez. I've heard all about the antebellum mansions, and there's several of them there, open to visitors. We went around on our bikes and looked at them. We didn't go in. I've seen one mansion. You kind of seen them all, but a couple of them sit high on the river bluff, overlooking the river. They're beautiful. A lot of Greek architecture in Natchez, which is interesting because in the South, in the deep South especially, you see a lot of these mansions are using the Greek pillars and the Greek architecture in the construction of their plantation house. I live in Nashville, which is called the Athens of the South, and there's an exact replica of the Parthenon in Nashville. And Nashvillians take very seriously the reputation of being the Athens of the South, because there's so many universities and colleges and a lot of culture in Nashville, and they weren't really all that excited about country music and the backward reputation that country music had. There's a part of Nashville called Bill Meade, which is sort of the pretentious, the old money part of Nashville, the high society types. Boy, they're not real wild about Music City, USA. They like the Athens of the South reputation better. Well, here we are down in Natchez, Mississippi, and you see this Greek influence again. So that's kind of interesting. The part of our country that is supposedly backward, the South, actually takes a lot of pride in copying ancient Greece and a lot of their architecture and some of their traditions and things. I just thought that was kind of interesting. Other things in Natchez, one of the things that really stood out, if you've never been, as far as something that they do, and it really kind of colors up the city, they line every street with crepe myrtles. And if you know anything about crepe myrtles, they bloom, most of them bloom kind of a pink, but pink, purple, and white. It's beautiful. I mean, they have the other thing we noticed is the presence of all these humongous oak trees, these live oak trees that you can tell have been there for hundreds of years. So they line the streets, and then in between them you have all these crepe myrtles. It's very beautiful. It's very picturesque. And then you have these big antebellum mansions. The other thing about Natchez is it sits way, way, way up on the bluff. Now, growing up, my dad was a Civil War buff, and he told me many, many times stories about Vicksburg. Vicksburg is upstream, and how Ulysses S. Grant, laid siege to the city. The river runs right by it. He rerouted the river, attempted to reroute the river so that the river would not run by the city, and he would starve out the locals because they wouldn't be getting any supplies or anything coming into the city. And right downstream, and of course Vicksburg was really important for control of the Mississippi River. The North already had control of the southernmost part, New Orleans, because of another site I'll tell you about later. But and they had control of the northern part, but they didn't have control of the middle part. If they could get control of the middle part, they would effectively cut the South in half, and all of the South that was across the river would be separated from the South that was on the eastern side of the river. So anyway, that was a long siege, and Ulysses S. Grant eventually succeeded in that. In fact, I think it was within a week of Gettysburg falling and Robert E. Lee surrendering in the east. So it was a terrible, terrible time for the South to lose both Vicksburg and Gettysburg almost at the same time. Anyway, right downstream from Vicksburg is Natchez, and on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, and this is true in Memphis too. Also, that's the high side. That's the side with the tall bluffs. Memphis has these tall bluffs. Vicksburg has the bluffs, and Natchez has these bluffs. And folks, I've always been told, oh yeah, they got these bluffs. And I assumed in my mind you're talking about 15, 25, 30 feet maybe. They're 180 feet high. And what they've done in Natchez is they've built the mother of all retaining walls along these bluffs, and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And there's a walking path right next to them, and there's a tiny little fence. It's the only thing that keeps you from falling over that bluff, over the side of that retaining wall, 180 feet down to the riverbed. It is the spookiest thing I've ever seen. And these people, that retaining wall runs right through people's front yards. So, they mow their grass right up to it. And right over the edge is a 180-foot sheer drop. It's completely vertical. It's not a phased-in slope. It is a sheer drop. Oh, my goodness. So you can see why it was so, that was the high ground. Now, across the river on the other side, they have to put up levees and things because it's a low ground. That's what floods. But if you got the high ground, you control the Mississippi. You just put your cannon all along the bluff there, and any ship that goes by, you just blow it to hell. Well, that was the reason why the North laid siege to Vicksburg and counted those parts of the river to be so important, to get that high ground so they could control the Mississippi River. Anyway, we saw all that. That night, my wife and I got in a car, and I'm a big music connoisseur. I love the stories of the blues and the rhythm and blues and early rock music, of course, country music. And so Ferriday, Louisiana is 15 minutes away from Natchez. And of course, Ferriday, Louisiana is this tiny little town that produced Jerry Lee Lewis, Jimmy Swaggart, and Mickey Gilley. And they're all cousins. They came from the same town. Now, if you know anything about rock and roll, then you know all about Jerry Lee Lewis. I mean, he's basically the father of rock and roll. He's the guy that put it on the map to a white audience, anyway. Elvis is the king, and it's ironic. They both come basically from the same basic area, and they both went to Memphis and made it big with the same recording studio, Sam Phillips, same guy. Anyway, I love Jerry Lee Lewis. Mickey Gilley's okay. I like Mickey Gilley, but I'm fascinated by his the family and how, as far as music is concerned, people don't realize Jimmy Swaggart. And of course, if you don't know who he is, he's that famous preacher. He's still alive. He still has a church in Baton Rouge that's on television. Pretty much every time you turn the TV on, it seems like he's on. But he's old now. But Jerry Lee has died. Mickey has died. But Jimmy's still alive. And in the early days, it was Jerry Lee who learned piano first. He was a prodigy. He just picked it up by ear and he just started playing. In Natchez, which I said was 15 minutes away, he got his big break at the Blue Cat Bar down on there's a bottom part, on the bottom part next to the river at the base of the bluff. They call that Under the Hill. And that's where all this unseemly action in town took place. That's where all the prostitutes hung out, the sailors. That's where the port was, basically, on the river. And that's where all the drunks hung out, the bars and the saloons. And you didn't go down there if you were up to any good. Well, that's where Jerry Lee, at age 13, was hired by the Blue Cat to come in and be the nighttime entertainment. The highlighted entertainer for the Blue Cat. Of course, right on the heels of that, he and his daddy sold enough eggs to buy enough gas to go to Nashville to try to get a recording contract. Nashville kicked him out and said, "No, we don't like your music." So they went on to Memphis and he recorded some songs there while Sam Phillips was on vacation. When Sam Phillips got back from vacation, Phillips listened to about 5 notes and said, "Get this, where is this guy?" And he got him back in there and they made a record. And of course, the first 3 records Jerry Lee made with a single sold 1 million copies each. Now, if you see where the town that he came from, and Jimmy Swaggart and Mickey Gilley, if you see Ferriday, Louisiana, it will amaze you the odds of 3 people making it that big from that little town. And it's like stepping into a third world country. I've never seen poverty like that. Everyone's just walking around aimless. Abandoned houses everywhere, boarded up, burned down houses that have just been left there as a shell. You go downtown, I don't even know why it's not even a downtown anymore. There's nothing there. We saw Jerry Lee's house, took pictures around Jerry Lee's house. Within a 1-block radius, there were 7 small churches. When I say small, I mean small. They're still there. Most of them are Assembly of God. And that, again, it played a huge role in Jerry Lee kind of funny story. He came from a real religious home. His mom, very religious, and so he was born and raised in that church. And when he got of age, I don't know, 13, 14, 15, whatever, they put him in a Bible institute. And the goal was to make a preacher out of him. And in one particular evening session, the minister asked Jerry Lee to come up and play the invitation hymn or whatever, and he went up there and played it boogie woogie style, and they kicked him out of the seminary, the Bible Institute, and the legend of Jerry Lee was born. I can just imagine him playing Just As I Am or whatever it was, boogie woogie style. But anyway, 7 little churches, 1 block radius around his house, and he was the biggest hellion. They said he was a hellion as a teenager in town. And if you see a picture of him, even as a little boy, he's got hellion written all over him. So if you know anything about, and here's something interesting. I've always heard stories about how he married his cousin. And what a pervert he must have been to marry his cousin. So I was doing a little research on it, and I found an article written by an author, actually a writer for a newspaper, who went to Ferriday and did an interview with all the people that knew Jerry Lee. And it turns out they're all related. And as he's trying to figure out who's related to who, evidently Jerry Lee had a rich uncle or somebody who moved there originally, and then everybody in the family followed, trying to glom onto him and get jobs and get money, whatever. Well, Jerry Lee's parents followed, and they all start intermarrying each other, to the point where the author makes a comment about how, as he's talking to several of these people, they're all trying to explain their relations. It was so twisted and so inbred that laughingly they were remarking about how he is his own uncle. And she is both niece and cousin or whatever. You know, it was all these different relations. The family tree didn't fork, in other words. And I've seen interviews with Jerry Lee all confused by the hubbub about why he married his cousin. And he said, well, I didn't think anything about it. Of course, she was like 14. He said, that's how everybody back home does it. And I've always sort of dismissed that in my mind, thought, well, that's just Jerry Lee being Jerry Lee. Well, after I saw the family tree in Ferriday and realized he was telling the truth, everybody intermarried. And so when he did it, of course, he married somebody within his own family. It was a real scandal to the outside world, but he didn't know about the outside world. He didn't know any of it. So, of course, that marriage didn't last, but it did produce a couple kids, I think. He had a very tragic history within his family, as far as his own personal family, kids dying, wives dying, etc., etc. But anyway, it was really fascinating to see. Like Elvis, Jerry Lee was influenced heavily by the black musical culture. There's a old nightclub. It's not in business anymore. Well, I guess it is still in business, but it's called Big Haney's. It was called Big Haney's, Big Haney, I think. And it's on the other side of town, and it's basically just like an old barn. And Jerry Lee would sneak in the back door, and they would let him, and he would listen as the black musicians, and there were some big names that came through there. B.B. King came through, Fats Domino came through, Aretha Franklin came through, and he would listen all night, and then he would rush home, and on the piano that his daddy bought by taking a second mortgage on their little humble home, he would recreate or replay or figure out how to play all the songs he just heard. He played everything by ear. And so when he went, these were all black musicians. So he's being influenced by black music. Elvis Presley is being influenced by black music. They both end up in Memphis almost at the same time. Look up the $1 Million Quartet. It was Elvis. It was Jerry Lee. It was Johnny Cash was in there. Carl Perkins was in there. They all came out of that same daggum little studio. I've been there. It's not a big studio. It's a tiny little hole-in-the-wall studio. Sam Phillips would play this, what a lot of people call race music, this music that sounded black, but these were white guys doing all this. And he would record it, and boy, it just went big time. It all came out of that little studio. And it's mainly these folks, these white guys, that were influenced by black guys and their music. And so it's really fascinating. And of course, Mickey Gilley got into the act a little later. There's the story of Jimmy Swaggart. You know, he chose the ministry, which is what Jerry Lee basically rebelled against. And so Jerry Lee spent his whole life singing for the devil, that's what he said, and Jimmy was preaching for God, and always trying to convince his cousin to come back and come into the fold and all that. But there's the story of Sam Phillips wanting to record Jimmy Swaggart early and signed him as well, because he was just as good, he was just as talented as Jerry Lee, but Jimmy was afraid to sign, even though he needed the money, because he didn't want to be, you know, he was preaching for God, and he thought what Jerry was doing was for the devil. And it was a very strong pull on him. It was a very strong pull on Jerry too, by the way. If you ever see an interview with him later in life, he's just racked with guilt about what he did for a living his whole life. And anyway, so I was really, that was important to me. I'm sharing this with you because I wanted to know the background and the context of what made Jerry Lee Jerry Lee. And just like the context that made Elvis Elvis, and why he lived the way he lived. If you ever saw a picture of Jerry Lee's home after he made it big and made all his money, it was the same deal as Elvis. It was a house for somebody who grew up poor, I mean really poor, and then came into this ungodly amount of money and gaudied it up. And so he just recently died, Jerry Lee. But boy, you talk about a pioneer in rock music. Nobody did it like Jerry Lee. And Mickey Gilley was kind of the cousin that, you know, he didn't chart his own path. Jimmy charted his own path. He preached. Jerry charted his own path. He blazed the rock and roll trail. Mickey kind of was the Johnny-come-lately that everybody thought was copying his older cousin Jerry Lee. And so he never was quite as big a star. But if you're in the country music scene, you know who Mickey Gilley was. Very much so. From Natchez, then we went back country. Now the Natchez Trace was done, so we went back country to Gulfport, Mississippi, down on the water. And the big attraction there for me, some more history. Oh, of course, all on the way, it's the Civil War history everywhere you look. But Gulfport is home to Jefferson Davis's home late in life. And so I went over to Jefferson. He's got a big mansion there that he bought late in life. He didn't build it, but he bought it late in life. And he wrote his memoirs there about the rise and fall of the lost cause, basically, in the Civil War. And he was the only president in the history of the Confederate States of America. And what really stuck out to me about Jefferson Davis's life was how tragic, you know, it ended. So that, you know, here he is, he rises to fame as the president, and then we have this big war, and his side loses, and even the Confederate South kind of turned their back on him. And he spent 2 years after the war in basically a prison as a prisoner of the North, and never was given his citizenship back. So to the day he died, he's virtually a man without a country. Couldn't get jobs, couldn't make a living, lost his livelihood, his plantation after the war, and so basically lived off the gratuity of former Confederates who still respected him and honored him and whatever. And one of them was this woman who owned this mansion down in Gulfport. So he wanted a quiet place where he could write his memoirs. So she invited him down. She had 2 little cottages on her property, and he rented one of them and began writing his memoirs. His wife would write down what he dictated. And at some point, the lady who owned it had cancer and she was dying, and she offered it to him after she died. He said, "No, I won't take it. I'll buy it from you." And so for the modest sum of $5,500, he bought hundreds and hundreds of acres down there in this beautiful mansion. And then before he died, he stipulated that this had to be turned into a museum for the Confederacy, not just for him, but also a home for Confederate veterans and a graveyard for Confederate veterans. So if you drive along Broadway, is it Broadway? forget the name of the road there, right there on the coast, and you go by Jefferson Davis's home, you'll see his home and the museum in the background. And the museum is very good. It was better than I expected. And of course, there's a lot of personal history in there. There's a Jefferson Davis exhibit in a room. But then there's a lot of Confederate history, a lot of Civil War history. And I don't think you can study the Civil War without visiting Jefferson Davis's home and of course his museum as well. Interesting little factoid: it sits right on the bay, and when they've had like 22, 23 hurricanes come through, including Camille, and it damaged it quite a bit, but Katrina about devastated it. Hurricane Katrina. My wife's laughing because her name is Katrina. So anyway, Hurricane Katrina came through and pretty much wiped out the entire everything. And they had to painstakingly rebuild everything. There is a monument to Jefferson Davis's horse. His horse's name, I believe, was Tartar, like tartar sauce. And he's on his back hind legs, and he's raised up in the air, and he's standing about 15, 18, 20 feet tall. This big bronze horse, and that's Jefferson Davis's horse. Well, when Hurricane Katrina came in and the tide went back out, it swept that horse, that monument, out to sea, and it ended up in the middle of the bay. And according to the locals, when it was low tide, you could see the horse out in the middle of the bay. It's a very shallow bay. You could see it. And then it was high tide, he'd get covered up with water. And this went on for several years while they're trying to rebuild Gulfport, and Biloxi, and all the areas along the coast there. And at some point they said, we got to go get that horse back. He's still out to sea, and he was standing right side up. So, you'd see the horse, and then you wouldn't see the horse. Then you'd see the horse, and you wouldn't see the horse. So, funny story, they went out with barges and cranes, and they lifted this thing up out of the muck and the sand, cleaned it out, and they put it back in the museum. So, I thought that was an interesting story. But that's the history in Gulfport. Of course, you just cannot get away from the Civil War history down here in this part of the country. So that was one day, and then the next day I said to my wife, I said, let's go out to Ship Island. And the idea was we'd go out to Ship Island, which is, the Mississippi River on this side. The Mississippi River, as it flows out, it's such a big river, it empties into the Gulf. And this side of the Gulf, if you get over to Destin and the Florida side or Alabama beaches, the water is beautiful. It looks like the Caribbean. It's that greenish hue, and you can see through it. You can see your feet when you're 20 feet deep out there. It's beautiful. And that's where all the white sandy beaches are. But on this part, you have the white sandy beaches, but you don't have the pretty water. It's brown water. And it's because of all that sludge and stuff that comes down the river. And by the time it gets over to Alabama, that stuff's gone, and now it's just the Caribbean looking water. So this is why it's not as touristy over here as it over there. So the locals say if you want the pretty water, you got to go out to Ship Island, which is 12 miles out. You can't even see it from the shore. And they have ferries that take you out there. And this was a very pivotal island, turns out, to the Civil War and the War of 1812 and other war, because it controls, there's these deep water channels, and the deep water channels are controlled by proximity of Ship Island. It controls basically the access to Gulfport and Big Bay there, but also it's close enough to New Orleans, it helps defend New Orleans. So control of that island was very important in the War of 1812 between us and the British. That's why Andrew Jackson was such a hero. The British had just beaten Napoleon, and in the War of 1812, they show up with 20,000 soldiers, take control of Ship Island, and they launch this big offensive against New Orleans. About that time, Andrew Jackson shows up from Nashville, probably went down the Natchez Trace to get there with a few soldiers, but he recruited the locals there in New Orleans, and he got rednecks and mercenaries and whatever he could find, and they successfully defeated what was most people consider the strongest army in the world. They just beat Napoleon, and the strongest navy in the world, and they have all this. They have control of Ship Island, which gives them great access to resupply and do what they need to do in New Orleans. And somehow Andrew Jackson beat them. And there's a long story about Andrew Jackson and his strong, dominant will, and he was stubborn as an ox. They called him Old Hickory for a reason. His men would fight to the death for him. And I think that had a lot to do with it. But anyway, so the War of 1812, Ship Island was really important, and it was really important in the Civil War as well, and for obvious reasons. And when the North got control of Ship Island, all the folks in Gulfport and Biloxi fled. These are Confederates. They fled upstate Mississippi up to Jackson and other places upstate, because the North basically turned that whole bay into what they called a Yankee Lake. And it was full of all the northern ships and everything, and so they fled for their lives, basically. There's a fort on Ship Island called Fort Massachusetts, and it's shaped literally like a horseshoe. And is this our exit? Okay. And so I went on a little tour of it, and they've got these enormous cannon. They're 15-inch, what they call rodmans, and each barrel weighs 50,000 pounds. So just getting those cannon into that fort, and of course they had 2 of them, I believe, and then they had a bunch of smaller 10-inch rodmans. But and it really, the way it was explained to me was they weren't real accurate, but that wasn't the point. They weren't really trying to defeat ships in the bay. They were trying to defeat ships who were trying to take the fort. And so they were a very strong deterrent, because if they hit you, they would even knock holes in the ironclads. Ironclads didn't want to get hit by these shells. And so Ship Island turned out to be a really, really strategic, of strategic importance in the Civil War. I guess it really wasn't that important in the War of 1812, because Jackson defeated the British, and they controlled it then. So that was a day we spent at Ship Island. And then today we went to New Orleans. Now, if you followed any of my Lee Harvey Oswald stuff or any of my JFK stuff, you know that if I'm going to New Orleans, I'm going to see all the sights. We started with, we went to Audubon Park first, which is where Lee Harvey Oswald and Judith Very would spend their afternoons when they weren't working on Medical Manhattan. They would go to Audubon Park, they'd read poetry to each other, they would sit and talk and romance each other. It was a place where they could kind of get away from people and be to themselves. They'd also go over to Monkey Hill, which is now part of the Audubon Zoo, and they'd roll down the hill. This is the highest point in New Orleans. They'd roll down the hill with the children. It was sort of a tradition. So we ate our lunch there, picnic lunch there, and then we went from Audubon Park to see the Tree of Life, which is a 350-year-old live oak tree that's hop, skip, and a jump from the park, and that was cool. The live oaks down here in the deep south are amazing, absolutely amazing. So the park's full of them. You can see they've been planted in rows and stuff, and they have these huge overlapping. You've seen the plantation photos and things. But anyway, from there we went to we got on Magazine Street, and we were preparing to go see Lee Harvey Oswald's house in New Orleans, which was right on Magazine Street. Before we could get there, we ran into, and I wasn't expecting to find this so easily, so quickly, but we found what was once part of the public health hospital here in New Orleans, which housed the infectious disease laboratory where Dr. Mary Sherman used the linear particle accelerator to zap the cancer soup and turn it into a more lethal potion that could be used to kill. At first it was mice, then it was monkeys, and then it was humans in 28 days. If you followed any of my Medical Manhattan project, you know all about that. And of course, we found the building where they wired up 2 million volts worth of electricity to run this linear particle accelerator. And this whole place was run down, and it was weed, and infested. It was overgrown with weeds and boarded up buildings, and just, but it's all surrounded by these very high brick walls to keep people out. And nobody wanted to go in. It was kind of a spooky place that people thought was haunted, whatever. It was a perfect place for them to do this work, to create this bioweapon. And we found that building, and if you want to learn more about that, you should read Ed Haslam's book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. It tells a great story about that. But anyway, that's we found that, and that's where Dr. Mary Sherman, who was one of the premier cancer doctors in the world at that time, was hired by Dr. Oshner, the other cancer specialist, to come down and help create this bioweapon. She didn't realize that's what she was being sent to do this, but that's what she ends up doing. So we found that, the infectious disease laboratory. So then we circle back to Exposition Boulevard or Drive, whatever, so that we could see Dr. Oshner's house and see the layout of all this hanky-panky that was going on. Dr. Oshner was the CIA guy that was the cancer doctor, and he was hired by the CIA to create this bioweapon. He was in charge of that project. Well, it turns out he lives right down the street from this infectious disease laboratory, which later became across the street from that. He built the Oshner Clinic. Oshner is a huge name. Alton Oshner is a huge name in New Orleans. If you remember the story I told you, in an effort to prove the polio vaccine was safe, effective, and potent, he injected his 2 grandkids with the polio vaccine and the Salk version, and within a day his grandson was dead and his granddaughter was paralyzed. Just awful. And he did that because he had invested in Cutter Labs. He had a huge investment at stake and didn't want to see the vaccine pulled. Now, this is the same Dr. Alton Oshner now who's working for the CIA creating this bioweapon. He hires Dr. Mary Sherman. So then we wanted to go see where Dr. Mary Sherman lived. We found her place. We went to Lee Harvey Oswald's place. We went to Judith Ferry's place. We saw all those sites, right? And then we wanted to see, well, let's go see where David Ferry lived, because David Ferry's 2 houses were the other 2 labs. There were 3 labs in that whole medical Manhattan project. The lab number 1 was David Ferry's house where he stored all the mice, later the monkeys. Lab number 2 was David Ferry's house across the street on Louisiana Avenue where they did the injections, and that was Judith Ferry and Lee. And then lab number 3 was the infectious disease laboratory where Dr. Mary Sherman zapped the potion, the cancer soup, with the linear particle accelerator, radiating it and making it more lethal. So we'd seen lab number 3, so we wanted to see lab numbers 1 and 2. So we found Louisiana Park Avenue, and we found David Ferry's house and his other house across the street. One of them looks identical to how it did in '63. The other one looks quite different. But so we saw that, and so the thing that really stuck out to me was every bit of this was all in basically the same general locale. And the main vein that connected all these different places was Magazine Street. And of course, Lee Harvey Oswald never had a car. They rode the streetcars, they rode the buses, but they were so close. They would rode. And so we said, well, let's go downtown and see where their day would begin every day. And of course, he and Judith would get on the bus and they go down to 640 Magazine Avenue, which is downtown amongst all the tall buildings. And that's where he and she worked their cover jobs at Riley Coffee. And we found Riley Coffee. It's not Riley Coffee anymore, but that's what it was, same building. We found it, and we went around the back where Lee Harvey would sneak out after he clocked in each day, and he would go through the parking garage across the block to the Newman building, which is literally catty corner from the Riley Coffee on the same block. And that's where he'd work with Guy Bannister and David Ferry, and he'd run his Fair Play for Cuba committee little shop out of the front of the Newman building. So he was pro-Castro in the front of the building. In the back of the building, when he was working with the CIA and Guy Bannister and all his ilk, David Ferry, he was anti-Castro. So you know all about the sheep dipping and stuff. So we saw that. The building's not there anymore, but we see the location, how close all that was. It was all within walking distance. And then we walked a little further down to where the Trade Mart used to be, owned by Clay Shaw, the guy who was brought to trial by Jim Garrison. And the Trade Mart's right down there on Canal, and right 3 blocks away. So all of these things are going on close. And then we went to the French Quarter, and we found what used to be the 500 Club, where Carlos Marcello would hang out in the evenings, and that's where Oswald would go, and Judith Ferry would go. Jack Ruby was there. He came to buy a showgirl, Jada, from Carlos Marcello, right there at the 500 Club. So he was there. Oh my goodness, everybody involved in this whole caper was there. So we went, and that was a wild place on Bourbon Street, but we did see it, and by that time it was 95 degrees, and it was humid, and we had been riding bike and walking, and we're getting back to the hotel now. We're going to jump in the pool because we sweat and we sweat, and then we dry off and go in air conditioning and eat, and then we go out and sweat again. So we have layers of sweat. But anyway, we got to see everything. It was so cool. So I'm just sharing all this with you because this is what happens when you go on vacation with me. We end up doing all this, and my wife was a good sport. She rode the bike the whole way. She was the navigator. She's back there with her phone, Google Maps, okay, telling me which direction to go as I'm barking out this location and that. But we made it, and
it was a great day.
It was a great day, and so on our way back, you may be wondering how we're going to go back. We're going to go to Tupelo on Sunday morning.